Mom, after dinner we're all going to talk about what's best for your future. I heard those words before I ever walked into the kitchen, and something about them made my hand freeze around the warm glass casserole dish I was carrying. Maybe it was the way Claire said future, stretching the word gently like she was wrapping a gift. Or maybe it was because after 68 years of life, after marriage and children and funerals and all the little heartbreaks that quietly pile up over time, I had learned that some smiles arrive carrying bad news. I stood in the hallway outside Daniel's pantry with my hand still on the brass doorknob, listening to voices I wasn't supposed to hear. Our family reunion had already started. I could hear laughter coming from the backyard, children running through the grass, silverware clinking against serving trays. Someone had turned on old Motown music, and the smell of grilled burgers floated through the house. It should have felt warm. It should have felt like family. But suddenly the casserole in my hands felt 10 pounds heavier. I know she'll resist at first, Claire said softly, but we'll explain that keeping a 4-bedroom house at her age doesn't make sense anymore. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That hurt more than anything. My son always had a habit when he was uncomfortable. Even as a little boy, he'd pause before speaking when he knew something wasn't right. I waited for him to laugh and say Claire was being ridiculous. I waited for him to defend me. Instead I heard his voice, low and tired. Let's just get through dinner first. Silence followed. Not agreement exactly, but not disagreement either. I stared at the pantry door and suddenly noticed tiny things around me. The floral wallpaper Claire had picked out last spring. The family photographs hanging down the hallway. Daniel at age 7 holding a baseball trophy. Daniel graduating college. Daniel on his wedding day. I remembered standing beside him for every single one of those moments. I remembered staying awake all night when he had pneumonia at 8 years old. I remembered clipping coupons when Robert and I were struggling because Daniel wanted soccer cleats. That cost $70. Funny how motherhood works. You spend decades building a life around someone else, and then one day you realize you've quietly become a guest in theirs. I heard Claire laugh lightly. Trust me. Once she understands, she'll see this is better for everyone. Better for everyone. I almost smiled at that. Better for everyone usually means better for someone. I just hadn't realized that someone wasn't me anymore. I took a slow breath and stepped away from the pantry before the floorboards beneath me could creak. I walked into the kitchen as if I hadn't heard a thing. Claire looked up immediately with that perfect smile of hers, the one she wore at church and school events and neighborhood cookouts. Margaret, she said brightly. You're here. Daniel turned around too, and for just a second I saw something pass across his face. Surprise maybe. Or guilt. It disappeared so quickly I almost thought I imagined it. Mom, he said, coming over to hug me. You made your casserole. Of course I did, I said gently. It's family reunion day. Claire kissed my cheek and took the dish from my hands. Everyone's outside waiting, she said. We've got a seat for you. I followed her toward the backyard and noticed where my chair had been placed. Long tables stretched across the patio under white string lights and summer flowers. Children sat in the middle. Couples sat together. Daniel and Claire sat at the center. My chair was at the far end of the table beside the napkins and extra serving spoons. I looked at it for a moment. Then I smiled and sat down. I have always believed there is a strange kind of loneliness that only exists in crowded rooms. You can sit surrounded by people who have known you for decades, and still feel like someone forgot to save a place for you. I sat at the end of the long patio table with my paper cup of iced tea, sweating little rings onto the white tablecloth while conversations floated around me like radio stations I could not quite tune into anymore. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Daniel's backyard. White string lights hung above us, even though they would not really be needed for another hour. Claire always liked things to look perfect. She once told me presentation mattered because people remembered how things felt. At the time I thought she meant warmth. Now I was not so sure. Across from me little cousins were laughing over a board game spread out near the grass. Someone was passing around homemade cookies. My niece Sharon was showing vacation photos on her phone, while everyone leaned closer to look. Daniel stood near the grill talking with his brother-in-law, smiling and nodding. I watched him laugh at something and realized I could not remember the last time I had heard him laugh with me like that. Strange how distance happens. There is never one big moment. Just tiny steps. Small enough that you hardly notice them until one day you look up and realize someone you love is standing miles away. Claire moved around the tables with a pitcher of lemonade, touching shoulders, smiling at people, making sure everyone had enough to eat. She stopped beside me and placed her hand lightly against my shoulder. "Margaret, are you comfortable over here?" she asked sweetly. I looked around the table for a moment. "I am fine," I said. "Good," she replied. "I just wanted everyone grouped together by families." Families. Such a simple word. I smiled and nodded. Then I watched her walk away. My eyes drifted toward the center of the table where Daniel sat with Claire and Grace beside them. Years ago, Robert and I used to sit at the center of every family gathering. Not because we asked to. Just happened naturally. Robert always had stories. People gathered around him without thinking about it. I remembered him sitting at Thanksgiving dinners carving turkey, while making terrible jokes that made everyone groan. I remembered his hand reaching under the table to squeeze mine after 40 years of marriage, as naturally as breathing. There was a time when I never had to wonder where I belonged. Then Robert passed away 3 years ago, and slowly things shifted. Slowly I shifted. I took a sip of my iced tea and looked down at the melting ice floating near the bottom of the cup. Nobody tells you that grief changes shape over time. First it feels like losing someone. Later it feels like losing pieces of yourself. As the evening moved on, I found myself doing something I had done more and more over the past few years. I sat quietly and watched. Age teaches you that people reveal themselves when they think no one is paying attention. Young people think truth hides in words. It does not. Truth lives in pauses, in glances, in little moments between sentences. I watched Claire standing near the kitchen doorway speaking with my sister-in-law Linda. She laughed softly and touched Linda's arm while nodding sympathetically. 20 seconds later Linda was smiling back at her, as if they had been close friends for years. Claire had always been good at that. She knew exactly how to make people feel chosen. I used to admire it. I thought Daniel had married someone warm and thoughtful. I remember the first Christmas after their wedding. Claire came into my kitchen wearing one of my aprons and insisted on helping me bake sugar cookies. Robert smiled at me from across the room and whispered, "Looks like we finally got the daughter we never had." I remember smiling back at him. I believed it too. Funny how memories change after you learn new things. You do not rewrite them exactly. You just start noticing details you missed the first time. My eyes moved toward Daniel. He was helping Grace refill paper cups with lemonade now. Grace said something and Daniel laughed before lightly bumping her shoulder. For a second I saw the little boy he used to be. I remembered him at 10 years old sitting at our kitchen table with tears in his eyes because another child at school had been left out during recess. Daniel had looked up at me and said, "I sat with him because nobody should eat alone." I remembered reaching over and smoothing his hair away from his forehead. I remembered feeling proud. The memory stayed with me for a moment before quietly fading away. Because now I sat at the edge of his table while conversations happened around me instead of with me. Nobody had been cruel exactly. That was what made it harder to explain. There were no raised voices. No había insults. Just small things. Tiny things. Claire asking Daniel about vacation dates while I sat beside them. Daniel discussing family plans without ever looking in my direction. The kind of moments that could each be dismissed on their own. But together they felt different. Together they felt heavy. Then I noticed something else. Earlier that spring Daniel had stopped asking me for advice about the house. Years ago he called me about everything. Which washing machine to buy. Whether he should repair the fence or replace it. Which color to paint the guest bedroom. Then suddenly those conversations stopped. Around the same time Claire began asking strange questions. Casual questions. Harmless questions. Or at least they seemed harmless then. "Margaret, is your mortgage paid off?" she asked one afternoon while helping me put dishes away. "Margaret, have you thought about downsizing?" Another time she smiled and said, "A 4-bedroom house must feel awfully quiet these days." At the time I answered politely because that is what people do. But sitting there now with melting ice in my cup and summer sunlight slowly disappearing across the lawn, those little moments began fitting together inside my mind like puzzle pieces clicking into place. I looked toward Claire again. She was smiling. Daniel was smiling too. And for the first time that evening I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. The sky had started turning soft shades of orange and pale blue by the time dinner was finally carried outside. The string lights overhead had begun glowing against the darkening evening, and someone lit citronella candles along the center of the tables. Their little flames danced in the warm breeze while conversations rose and fell around me. Plates passed from hand to hand. Glasses clinked together. Laughter drifted through the yard. Everything looked exactly like the kind of family evening people frame in photographs and place on mantels. I sat quietly and watched Claire move through it all like someone conducting an orchestra. She brought extra napkins before anyone asked. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered favorite drinks and food preferences. Everyone seemed relaxed around her. Everyone seemed comfortable. Robert used to tell me something years ago. Whenever we attended neighborhood parties, he would squeeze my hand and whisper, "Pay attention to the person working hardest to look perfect." I used to laugh at him because I thought he was teasing. Robert always noticed things other people missed. Maybe that was why he had been so successful in business. Or maybe it was simply because he listened more than he talked. I suddenly found myself thinking about one afternoon nearly 2 years earlier. Robert and I had been sitting on our front porch drinking sweet tea. It was late spring and the dogwood tree in our yard had just started blooming. Claire and Daniel had visited earlier that day. After they left, Robert sat quietly for a while staring across the street. I remember asking him what was wrong. He smiled and shook his head at first. Then he looked over at me and said, "Promise me something, Margaret." I laughed because his expression seemed so serious. "What?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the yard. "If anything ever happens to me, do not let anyone convince you that your home is too much for you." I remember frowning. "What kind of conversation is that?" I asked. Robert smiled again, but there had been something thoughtful behind his eyes. "Just promise me." I rolled my eyes and nudged his shoulder. "Fine. I promise." Then we laughed and moved on to talking about grocery shopping and whether the front porch needed repainting that summer. I had forgotten about that conversation. Completely forgotten it. Until now. Sitting there at the end of Daniel's table, hearing forks scrape gently against plates and children running through the grass, I felt that memory settle inside me like a stone dropping into still water. Robert had never spoken carelessly. Not about important things. Across from me, Claire was smiling as she poured iced tea into Daniel's glass. Daniel thanked her without looking up. Then she glanced toward me for just a second. Her smile stayed exactly the same. Perfect. Polite. Warm. But suddenly I remembered something else. 3 months before Robert passed away, Claire had walked through our house slowly during Sunday dinner. I remembered her standing in the hallway near the staircase. "This place has amazing bones," she said casually. "Houses like this are impossible to find now." At the time I thought she was admiring it. Tonight I looked around Daniel's backyard and felt a quiet chill move through me despite the warm summer air. Sometimes memories do not return because we miss the past. Sometimes they return because our hearts finally understand what our minds were not ready to see. By the time dessert came out, the sky had gone dark and the little string lights above us had become the brightest things in the yard. Someone brought out slices of pie and bowls of vanilla ice cream. The younger children were chasing fireflies near the fence, while the adults settled deeper into their chairs with coffee and quiet conversation. The evening had taken on that comfortable feeling family gatherings sometimes have near the end, when everyone becomes softer and slower. But I no longer felt comfortable. I felt awake. Truly awake. I was staring down into my coffee cup when I noticed someone standing beside me. I looked up and saw Grace shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She had Robert's eyes. I noticed that every time I looked at her, the same thoughtful blue eyes that always seemed to be watching more than people realized. "Grandma," she said quietly, "can I show you something?" I smiled gently. "Of course, sweetheart." She glanced toward the table before leaning down closer to me. "Maybe not here." There was something in her voice that made me set my cup down immediately. Not fear exactly. More like uncertainty. We walked toward the side of the house where soft yellow light spilled from the kitchen windows onto the grass. The sounds of laughter behind us became quieter. Grace folded her arms across herself and looked down at her sneakers. For a few seconds she did not say anything. "Grace?" I asked softly. She looked up at me and bit her lip. "Grandma, I think I need to tell you something and I do not know if I am doing the right thing. My stomach tightened. What is it? She looked back toward the yard again. I was not trying to snoop, she said quickly. I swear I was not. Sweetheart, take your time. She nodded. Slowly. A few days ago, Mom asked me to email some pictures from her laptop because her phone was charging. She paused. And while I was sending them, I saw something. I stayed quiet. Grace looked guilty now, almost ashamed. I was not trying to read anything, but there was this email open already. She swallowed hard. I saw your name. The warm summer air suddenly did not feel warm anymore. What kind of email? I asked carefully. Grace hesitated. Mom was writing to somebody about paperwork. She said something about helping you move and simplifying things. But she looked at me again and her face changed. Grandma, it did not sound like helping. I felt my hands become very still in my lap. What did it sound like? Grace looked down at the grass beneath her feet. It sounded like they were already making plans for your house. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Somewhere in the distance I heard children laughing and a dog barking 2 houses away. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. But suddenly they felt very far away. Grace reached into the pocket of her sweater and slowly pulled out her phone. Then she looked up at me with uncertain eyes. I took a picture because something felt wrong and I kept thinking about it all week. She held the phone out toward me. Grandma, I think you should see it. My eyes stayed on Grace's phone for several seconds before I finally took it from her hands. Suddenly it felt heavier than a phone should feel. Funny how objects can do that. Funny how a few words on a screen can weigh more than a box of old family photographs. I looked down and saw an email chain open across the screen. Claire's name sat at the top beside a date from 4 days earlier. I read slowly. Maybe part of me hoped I was misunderstanding something. Maybe part of me still wanted to believe there was another explanation. There was not. I read. Once Margaret agrees, the house should sell quickly. Similar homes in her neighborhood are going for strong numbers right now. I felt my heartbeat become quieter somehow. Not faster. Quieter. Daniel thinks she will resist emotionally at first, but once we explain that maintenance and taxes are becoming too much for her, she should understand. Below that was another line. We should discuss timing before fall, so we can start planning renovations and financing options. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Renovations. Financing options. Timing. There was not a single sentence asking what I wanted. Not one sentence asking whether I was happy where I lived. Not one sentence asking whether I was ready. My home had somehow become a project. A transaction. A future investment. I handed the phone back to Grace very carefully. She looked at me with worried eyes. Grandma? She asked softly. I realized I had not spoken for several seconds. Are you okay? I looked toward the backyard where everyone was still laughing beneath the string lights. Daniel was carrying fresh coffee cups to the table. Claire was smiling at something my sister-in-law had said. The scene looked beautiful from where I stood. Peaceful. Warm. I thought about how strange truth can be. Sometimes nothing changes after you learn it. The same people stand in the same places. The same voices laugh at the same jokes. But somehow everything becomes different anyway. Grace touched my arm gently. I am sorry, she whispered. I turned toward her and saw tears gathering in her eyes. Sweet girl. She looked like she thought she had broken something. I smiled and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Do not apologize, I said quietly. You did not create this. She looked down. I just kept thinking about Grandpa. The words caught me by surprise. Grandpa? I asked softly. She nodded. He always used to tell me that if something feels wrong in your heart, you should pay attention. I looked at her and suddenly Robert felt close again. Almost as if he had somehow placed us there together in that moment beside the house with the kitchen light spilling across the grass. I smiled gently. He told me that too. We stood there quietly for a few seconds. Then I looked back toward the table again. I expected anger. I expected hurt. I expected something loud and painful inside me. Instead I felt something else entirely. Stillness. Cold stillness. Like the moment before snow starts falling. I took a slow breath and smoothed my hands against my dress. Then I looked down at Grace and smiled. Sweetheart, I said softly, I need you to do me a favor. She looked up immediately. What? I looked toward the glowing backyard one more time. Do not tell anyone we had this conversation tonight. Grace studied my face for a few seconds as if she were trying to understand something. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, she said quietly. I will not tell anyone. I squeezed her hand gently before we started walking back toward the backyard. Halfway there I looked up at the night sky. The stars had begun appearing overhead, faint at first. I used to stand outside with Robert on summer nights like this after everyone had gone home. We would sit on our porch swing with glasses of iced tea and watch the neighborhood grow quiet. Robert always said the world became more honest at night because there were fewer distractions. I never understood what he meant until I got older. During the day people perform for each other. They smile and wave and play roles. But eventually the lights dim and the noise fades away. Eventually truth sits down beside you whether you want it to or not. When we reached the patio table again, Claire looked up immediately. There you two are, she said brightly. I was beginning to think we lost you. Grace slid quietly into her seat without answering. I sat down and picked up my coffee cup again. It had gone cold. Daniel looked toward me with a small smile. Everything okay, Mom? Funny question. People ask it all the time without really expecting an answer. I looked at him for a moment. The little boy who once cried over a lonely child at school was still there somewhere behind his face. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Everything is fine, I said gently. Daniel smiled and nodded before turning back toward the conversation beside him. Fine. Such a useful word. Fine can hide almost anything. Claire stood suddenly and clapped her hands lightly together. Before everyone leaves, she said with a cheerful smile, I thought we could do something fun. People looked up from their desserts. Someone laughed and asked what she meant. Claire rested one hand against Daniel's shoulder and smiled wider. Family reflections. Few people smiled. Others looked confused. Everyone says something they are grateful for this year. There were quiet laughs around the table. My niece Sharon said she was grateful her youngest son had finally started sleeping through the night. Linda said she was grateful for retirement. Daniel said he was grateful for family and stability. Then Claire spoke. I am grateful for new beginnings, she said warmly. I think life gives us opportunities to make positive changes, even when they feel difficult at first. Her eyes moved toward me for less than a second before returning to the table. Less than a second, but I saw it. I sat very still. New beginnings. Positive changes. Difficult at first. I thought about the email. I thought about the pantry conversation. I thought about Robert sitting beside me on the porch asking me to promise something all those years ago. Suddenly another memory surfaced. About 6 months before he passed away, Robert had organized all our paperwork one Saturday afternoon. I remember teasing him for acting like an accountant preparing for the end of the world. He smiled at me and said, I just like knowing things are in order. I had laughed and gone back to folding laundry. I never asked questions. I never thought I needed to. My fingers slowly tightened around my coffee cup. Then something quiet and unexpected settled over me. I realized I was done feeling confused. I was done wondering whether I was imagining things. Because sometimes the hardest part is not discovering the truth. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting that you finally have. The evening began winding down after that. Chairs shifted across the patio. People stretched and gathered purses and jackets while saying long goodbyes that somehow always took another 20 minutes. Children rubbed tired eyes and leaned against their parents. The little citronella candles had burned lower now, their tiny flames barely moving in the warm air. I sat quietly and watched everyone the same way I had been watching all evening. But now I was seeing something different. I was seeing patterns instead of moments. Claire kept glancing toward Daniel. Daniel kept checking his watch. Twice I saw Claire look toward me before quickly looking away again. Not nervous exactly. Expectant. As if she were waiting for something. Then finally I saw it. Claire leaned closer to Daniel and whispered something into his ear. Daniel nodded once without looking at her. Just once. A few seconds later he stood up. My heart did not race. I noticed that immediately. Earlier that night I would have felt panic or confusion. Earlier that night I would have been wondering if I was misunderstanding things. But confusion had disappeared somewhere along the way. In its place was something quieter. I simply waited. Daniel cleared his throat lightly and smiled around the table. "Before everyone heads home," he said, "Claire and I wanted to talk about something." The conversations around us softened. Family members looked up. Claire reached over and rested her hand gently against Daniel's arm with that same warm smile she always wore. "Nothing serious," she added quickly with a little laugh. "We just care about family." Care about family. Strange phrase. People often say those words right before asking for something. Daniel looked toward me and smiled. "Mom," he said carefully, "Claire and I have been thinking lately about making life easier for you." Easier. There it was again. Different words. Same package. I looked at him quietly without saying anything. Daniel shifted in his chair a little. "You have that big house all by yourself now and we just worry sometimes." Claire nodded sympathetically. "We only want what is best for you, Margaret." Around the table people looked uncomfortable but polite. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked questions. I looked around slowly at every face beneath the glowing lights. Some looked confused. Some looked curious. Grace sat completely still across from me. Her eyes met mine for a second. Then I looked back toward Daniel and Claire. Suddenly I remembered something Robert once told me while we were cleaning out our garage years ago. He held up an old box filled with things we had forgotten and smiled at me. "People show you who they are when they think they already have." The answer. I did not understand him then. I understood him now. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and looked at my son with a gentle smile. Then for the first time all evening, I decided not to stay silent. The night had become very quiet by then. Even the children had stopped running through the yard. Somewhere in the distance I could hear crickets beginning their evening song. The little candles on the table were almost burned out now, leaving small pools of melted wax beside paper plates and half-finished coffee cups. I looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. Then I smiled softly. "You know," I said gently, "your father used to tell me something." Daniel blinked and shifted slightly in his chair. Claire's smile stayed perfectly in place, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the edge of her cup. "He always said people become very generous with things that do not belong to them." Silence settled over the table. Not heavy silence. Careful silence. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked around at everyone sitting beneath the lights. "Tonight has been interesting for me," I continued quietly. "I spent most of the evening remembering things." Nobody interrupted. Daniel looked confused now. Claire gave a small uncertain laugh. "Margaret, I do not think we understand." I turned toward her with the same calm smile. "I think you do." Her smile faded only a little. Just enough. I looked back toward Daniel. "You know, sweetheart, when your father was still here, he spent months organizing documents and paperwork. At the time I thought he was simply being careful." I paused. "Robert was always careful." Daniel stared at me now without speaking. He wanted things protected. He wanted things clear. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap. I never paid much attention because I trusted family. Across the table Grace lowered her eyes. I smiled at her gently before continuing. Tonight reminded me that trust and assumptions are not the same thing. Claire sat very still now. I could almost feel the air changing around us. Family members exchanged uncomfortable glances but stayed silent. I looked directly at Daniel. "My home is not a burden." My voice stayed soft, steady. "It is where your father and I built our lives together. It is where I raised you. It is where every Christmas morning and every birthday candle, and every hard season of our lives happened." Daniel opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. "And if I ever decide to leave it one day, that decision will belong to me." Claire swallowed. "Margaret, we were only trying to help." I looked at her and smiled politely. Help begins with a conversation. Plans begin with assumptions. Nobody spoke after that. The little candles flickered softly between us. Daniel looked down at the table. For the first time all evening he looked like a little boy again. Not because he was innocent, because he looked ashamed. I slowly stood up and reached for my casserole dish that still sat near the end of the table, almost untouched. Funny thing about casseroles. People usually come back for seconds when they feel comfortable. I picked it up and looked toward Grace. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "you come visit Grandma soon. I still owe you homemade peach pie." Grace smiled through wet eyes and nodded. Then I looked at everyone one last time. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel hurt anymore either. Some truths hurt while they are arriving. But once they finally sit down beside you, they become strangely quiet. I walked toward my car beneath the soft glow of the porch light, and for the first time that evening, I did not feel left out. I felt free.